Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week is another little selection of Wallsend tales from the past. And as with the other videos, some of the stories may be longer than others, and they are all from various different years and not in any particular order. However, I must add here that a few of the stories this week do follow the same theme and even the same area, such as the Burn Closes. Anyway, I hope you will find them interesting. The first story this week dates from 1939 and was an article that was printed regarding Holy Cross ruins, and the ruins were often in the papers as people did try to protect them from being damaged. On this occasion, the article discussed how new houses were being built quite close to the ruins, and they were now hoping that the church could be changed. It was hoped that the land could be fenced off in a new way. It already had a fence around it from around 1909, although some say earlier, and I had always believed it was around 1905. Anyway, this time they were hoping the fenced-up area could be a little larger and that the ruins could be made into a kind of tourist attraction. The article stated that they could not be entirely sure when the church was actually built, but they suggested it was sometime in the mid-12th century. In more recent articles, the church ruins are given a date of around 1190. The 1939 article suggested it was after 1110, but before 1177, so that would give it a slightly earlier date than the one we know of today. The article was clear to point out that the church was built using the stones taken from the Roman wall, and they said that it was very much of interest for people from other areas to want to come and view it, and they hoped that this might happen. They also talked of the old water pump down the burn, which I have discussed in a few different videos, saying that it had once supplied the village of Wallsend with its water. They also talked of how the original coffin path from Wallsend could no longer be clearly seen, but the old coffin steps were still visible to the right of the new concrete steps that had been built several years prior to 1939. They briefly discussed how the old churchyard had fallen into disrepair, how gravestones had been removed, and railings around some of the graves had been broken. They discussed how the gravestones remaining had all been gathered up and enclosed behind the fence to stop them from being damaged any further. And this is something that I have definitely discussed before, as I know that people are buried outside of the current fenced-off area. The article talked of some of the more interesting old gravestones and the history of the people buried there. Sadly, now those gravestones can mostly no longer be seen. In the end, it was said that the future of the church was something that really needed to be discussed. It seems, however, that nothing came of these ideas. Perhaps the outbreak of the Second World War meant no further discussions were had on the subject, and by the time the war was over, the ideas had been forgotten about. I must admit, a little sad that their ideas did not take shape, as I think it would have been nice to have had the area expanded somewhat and some plaques put in place to explain the history of the church and to also include some details of some of those who are buried there in graves that we can no longer see. In 1911, an article appeared in the newspaper stating that very soon the land known as the Burn Closes would be in the possession of the town council. It was a gift from Sir J.B. Hunter and the Wallsend Land Syndicate. After this, it was said the council would then lay out the land in the form of a public park, which they hoped would stop the people of Howden from asking for a park of their own, as they felt the Burn Closes would serve the purpose well for them. The land had first been offered to the town at the start of 1911, and it had taken a while to arrange all the finer details, and at one point nothing had happened for quite some time, and the matter was raised at the council meetings to try and get things sorted. Perhaps one issue had been the fact that initially it had been hoped the council would buy the land, but after much discussing and an obvious clear no thanks from the council, it was agreed that the land should be given as a gift with no cost to the council at all. Some interesting plans were discussed. It was said that in the summer months, many people used the stream in the burn for bathing. The idea was suggested that they should maybe build an outdoor pool, or an open air pool in the burn, so that the lads of the area, clearly women and girls did not use the water in the burn for bathing, could swim under cleaner conditions. However, they now realised that the building of the public baths at Wallsend made this idea less appealing. The council stated that they did not want to take people away from the baths, and the outdoor pool would probably not go ahead. However, they did know that the idea had really been taken to the heart by the people of the town, and they thought they might have trouble explaining why they would no longer do it. Of course, no outdoor pool was ever built in the burn closes, and I have to admit that this was probably a good thing, as no doubt it would have taken away a lot of the land for those who wanted to walk from one end to the other, and it may also have caused some big issues with flooding. In 1927, the application to hold a fair down the burn at Easter by Mr. Murphy was rejected. The council stated that the land had not yet settled from the several years of work that had been done on it, and the idea of the land being used, as they put it, as a showground was not a good one. Mr. McNamara was not too happy about this. He said it was good for the town to have entertainment. The people wanted and needed it, and he said he regretted the council's decision to refuse permission for the fair. Of course, most people of Wallsend know that this would not last, and a fair down the burn at Easter soon became a regular thing, something that continued over the years until finally coming to an end in the mid to late 1990s. And I can certainly remember going to the fair down the burn. It was often just a pile of mud and clots, but sometimes that was all part of the fun. It was nice to have somewhere to go within walking distance of your own home, and not to have to travel to the town moor for the shows in the summer there. The final article about the burn closes comes from 1928, when it was suggested that a water fountain was to be built in the burn, and the cost was to be around £50, and the proposal had been accepted. Now, I didn't find any further news reports on this subject, and I am not actually aware that this fountain was ever built, so perhaps the idea was not fully agreed upon. So can anybody listening to this remember there being a fountain in the burn? And I obviously don't mean the little spring next to the old Wallsend pump, but something purpose-built, though perhaps not quite on the same grand scale as the Duffy Memorial Fountain in the park. If you do know anything about it, do please let me know in the comments below. And just to end my little section on the burn closes, I do know, like I've said before, that many of you know about the Easter fairs down the burn, and I'm sure that many of you do have great memories of the fair as well, so I really would love to hear your memories in the comments below. In 1911, the newspapers reported that coronation celebrations would be held in Wallsend. However, they had suggested that celebrations for the children should be postponed until July. It was said that many of the children would not be at home in June, so they wanted to wait until they returned to school in July. It was then suggested that the children, approximately all 9,000 of them, would be treated to tea and given a coronation medal. There would also be a sports day for the children, and the council asked if the people of Wallsend would help with the celebrations by decorating their own homes. They actually asked for houses to be illuminated, so that did make me wonder how people would have done that. It would not be as easy as it is today, where many houses have big displays of lights outside at Christmas time. And I kind of have an image of every house in Wallsend with a few candles in their front windows. Meanwhile, in June of 1911, many things would be going on in Wallsend to celebrate the coronation, spread over 2 days. A band would be playing in Wallsend Park on both days, from dawn until dusk, so the paper said, which seems like quite a long time, considering it would have been daylight until quite late at night, and dawn would have been around about 4 a.m. So I think the actual time the band was playing would have probably been a lot shorter than that. Fairy lights would also be displayed in the park, and on the first day of the celebrations there would be a large bonfire down the burn, and on the second day there would be a public firework display. Now, I must admit that this was the first time I'd come across any articles that suggested fireworks would be used for anything other than bonfire night. All in all, it does sound like Wallsend had made a big effort for the celebrations, and I am sure that the people of Wallsend would have had an enjoyable couple of days. Finally this week, a couple of teeny little snippets of news from 1928. It was said that the coast road was going to be lit, and this would be at a cost of around £470 and would help visibility for cars at night. And it was also suggested that bus stops should be marked on the coast road so that people knew where the buses were going to stop. The Sanitary Committee had asked that the houses in the area known as Palmer's Building should be fitted with a decent water supply, which was something they didn't currently have. It was suggested that the council would do the work and the money would be recovered from the respective owners of the houses. Also, still in 1928, it was agreed that the council would borrow the sum of £4,900 to build a chapel at Holy Cross Cemetery and also a caretaker's house. 69 people had applied for the caretaker's job, and Mr. Walter Lonsdale had been chosen for the position. And finally, it was stated that the post of parkkeeper had been advertised, and it was noted that up to the time the paper was printed, only one man was being considered for the job. Sadly, the article did not enlighten the readers of the newspapers as to who this man was, so if anyone knows who was the parkkeeper in Wallsend in 1928, do please let me know. I do hope that you have enjoyed this week's selection of little stories. I do think that this week they have been a little more about similar subjects with only a few different little things thrown into the mix. But I do hope that you have still found them interesting. And as always, I do thank you all very much for watching. And I do look forward to seeing you all again next week.